Good morning, Master Class, and it is April the 16th, 2021, and we are in chapter 11 of Surprised by Hope by N.T. Wright. We are only this chapter, and then next week we get to shift to what I've been waiting for. Just excited to get to part 3, chapter 12. So we'll get through chapter 11 today. And again, I will try to give you the big picture of what I think chapter 11 is about and how it fits into what we've already studied. You remember his viewpoint is that you die, then something happens, which is chapter 11, and we'll talk about what happens. And then eventually you have what's talked about in Revelation 21 and 22, the new heaven, the new earth come together, and that's where we will be with our resurrected bodies forever with God. So we know the beginning, which is we die, and we know the end, which is we're going to live forever on the new heavens and the new earth. So everybody got that straight. We're good, right? And that's why we talked about resurrected bodies all the time. Now we're going to talk about what's in between. And I will tell you when this starts, no matter how hard you study this, you are not going to have a clear answer when it's all over. So I'm going to give you, as he does, here are some alternatives, and you can think through the scriptures, and you can figure out what you think is the real case. And if you want to go look for it, you'll find a book somewhere that'll back up what you believe, whatever it is that you want to believe. First of all, we will talk about, is there a hell? So I want to give you that. So the reason that starts is if God is just, then the righteous should get rewarded and the wicked should get punished. And that's his nature. So the question is, how much will he punish people? Kind of the traditional view of hell for a lot of churches in time has been the hell that we see in the paintings, which is it's a horrible place. You're going to burn forever, and the devil's going to torture you. I've heard it taught that it's like falling in an elevator shaft for the rest of your life, but it's in intense heat and it's just awful. So for all eternity, that's what's going to happen to you. So you can find people who will make hell worse and worse and worse. And because if you should get punished, then the punishment should get worse and worse. You will also find people who will either based on scripture or based on their own believe that what happens to the wicked is they just get annihilated. They just cease to exist. And that's punishment, because the reward would be the opposite. You get to be with God in heaven. But you cease to exist, which is a bad thing. There are other people who believe there's no hell because you get to get recycled until you finally come to belief in Jesus, and then you get to go to heaven. There is just a lot of viewpoints on how bad hell is and if there is a hell. My contention, and I like the book by Francis Chan. He has a book on hell that I think is probably the best book out there. And he would tell you hell is a real place. It's a bad place. And that's where people who don't accept Jesus go. Now, so I would recommend maybe that book, and I believe the name of that book is Erasing Hell. It's been a few years since I've read it. He would give you the more traditional, straight biblical view on it. So I think he's very scriptural in what he does. So I would recommend that book for hell. The main argument against hell is that a good God would not send people to hell forever. That's the way some people view the nature of a good God. But I don't like to argue from that direction, because that means that I'm deciding on my own what the nature of God is. And I don't want to do that. I think we should depend on God to tell us his nature. And God's nature, he tells us, is he is a righteous God, he is a just God, and the wicked will be punished. So that's the discussion on hell that I will start with, and I will stop there and see if anybody has questions that they want to talk about hell. If you do, I'll chat about it to the degree I'm able to. Okay, again, if that's a subject of interest, get Erasing Hell by Francis Chan, and he will refer to a lot of other books in there if you want. So that is one place. If you don't go to heaven, you go to hell. That's I think the traditional view, and I think the right view. But what happens in between, before you end up at one of those places? You die, and then where do you go? And here are some of the choices, and he talks about them in this chapter. One is purgatory. Purgatory is kind of a made up place that the Catholics came up with, where it's kind of a holding tank. Now, I believe the Catholics have since refuted all the teachings on purgatory. So I don't think that that's a really important topic for us anymore. At one time, I think it was probably for Christians, but I think everybody's kind of come to the conclusion that probably purgatory, at least the way it used to be taught, is not viable. Another thing that is viable is the idea that you sleep. And you stay asleep until you go to either the first heaven or the second heaven. And he makes a note in here, and we'll talk about it in a minute, that maybe it's an idea of your body goes to sleep and then it gets resurrected, but your soul doesn't necessarily in that situation. So I thought that was an interesting thought. I don't remember reading that before. Other people believe if you die, you go straight to the first heaven, where God is. This is the heaven that's talked about in the Old Testament, some talked about in the New Testament. And that would be the type of heaven that's described by Ezekiel, for instance, described by John in the first part of Revelation, where God is. There's got a throne there. Jesus is by him in the throne. You have all the spiritual angels and so forth. The main, I think one of the reasons that is viable for a lot of people is it talks about the martyrs that can seem to see earth from there. So the martyrs are the souls of the martyrs are in heaven. So that is one of the things that causes people to go there. I don't have a firm view on this. I'll just have to tell you, I like to think that we go straight to the first heaven and then we'll go into the second heaven from that. But I also don't have a problem at all with thinking I get to go to sleep until the second heaven, that I'm kind of in suspended. So in this chapter, he's going to talk about some of those alternatives. But again, there are books on that, and you can find lots of books to do that. I do think one of the things that's important to think about when you go to this subject is if it were really that critical for us to know the answer, I think there would have been a chapter that says, when you die, this is exactly what's going to happen to you. And it would have just been laid out in 20 verses, and it would have just been made crystal clear. And I don't think we have that. I think there are clues, and I think there are references, and I think you can put together a story, but I just don't think it was meant to be explained that way. And one of the reasons that we'll talk about that is, and it's in this chapter, is that the gist of the Bible is, how does God work with the entire church and the entire world and then individuals get to go along with that. But our focus into modern times has been much more, how does God deal with me individually? And so what's happened is the focus has changed, and we get wrapped up believing the Bible is kind of following the same thing that our current society is, which is it's all about me. God wrote the Bible so I can figure out what's going to happen to me. And it just doesn't seem to me that that's what the Bible's written to be. So again, I will pause there, and then we will get into the chapter if anybody wants to talk about that. I also, by the way, don't have a problem if somebody wants to believe people go straight to heaven and live there forever and ever. I'm happy that they've gotten there, and that's where they are. That's good. So I do not feel strongly about any of this enough to take a position that is just firm into sentence, because I don't believe the Bible does that. Carolyn?
LaGard Smith has just written a book about this. And, he's the one that put together the chronological Bible that we use, and probably the first Church of Christ author I've ever heard address this. And I've heard what his contention is, but I don't want to repeat it because I haven't read the book myself.
I have that book, but I don't have it here at this house. And he does get into some really interesting things. And I know when he wrote the book, if it's the same book I've got, he got a lot of heat from a lot of people. Because when you take some stances on this stuff, somebody's going to find a verse that goes against what you're pushing. And I'm pretty sure when I read it, my thought was, there's a whole bunch of churches of Christ that are going to not be happy with him. So it is a good book, and it is worth reading, but it will not, as I recall, it's not sure. He doesn't give some of the traditional views. So our traditional views, as he points out in this book over and over, our traditional views are driven by Hollywood and society, much more than by the Bible, very, very often. And so I think N.T. Wright he's as intellectually honest as you can get. He doesn't come always to the conclusion that I think necessarily he could come to. But I do think he tries to take into account all of the scripture and all the history, everything he knows. And I think he tries to take into account the historical views of the church and so on, and come up with some good answers.
Well, I have learned a lot from this book. I really appreciate this point of view and his study and research. It's encouraging.
I'm surprised Episcopals haven't and the Anglicans haven't kicked him out of church, because he is way too rational and conservative and way too biblical for them. But he's done well. So anyway, those are the ideas. We didn't talk about paradise, but we'll talk about that some more. Paradise being something different than heaven where God dwells. And he'll give us some ideas when we go through here. So anyway, that's the overall view. Was there anything anybody wanted to say that they thought differently, or they picked up some of this differently, just an overall view before we get there? Rod?
Well, not necessarily that, but middle schoolers and high schoolers, and they love to ask this question about all these things, about particularly hell, and it's just, I've had such a hard time trying to answer these, and I think what you say is correct. I think you have to be, first you got to be honest and say, I don't know, and I can't see scripture, that just nails it. just nails it. And, but we do know there's something good that awaits us, and there's something bad that awaits those who deny Christ.
Right.
And sometimes with kids, sometimes that's a great answer, because we're not trying to support any preconceived notions of what it is, or how people suffer in hell, and why would God send people to hell. And we have some answers to why he would have a place that's not good. But that's kind of my simplistic answer to kids when they answer that, when they ask that question or think about that. And I think it's good they think about it, because it is kind of a nebulous area.
And the simplistic view, I think, is where I've ended up. The simplistic view is what you said. The wicked will be punished. The righteous will be rewarded by living with God forever. And resurrected bodies on this earth. That's my simplistic view. And that's good enough for me. And I've got stacks of books, and you can find them wherever that will support any notion you want in between there. All right, well, let's go ahead and look at some of the passages, and then we will go through there. Again, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of I'm not going to spend any time on purgatory. Actually, I'm going to move on, and I'm going to go to 168 and talk. I'm going to go to the kind of the bottom of page 168, where it says, we should recall in particular that the use of the word heaven to denote the ultimate goal of the redeemed, though of course hugely popular by medieval and subsequent piety, is severely misleading and does not begin to do justice to the Christian hope. In other words, he's talking about what we think of as the first heaven here. That's not our ultimate goal. The ultimate goal, and he talks about this below, the ultimate destination is not going to heaven when you die, but being bodily raised in the transformed, glorious likeness of Jesus Christ. And that's in the second heaven that we've talked about. So the goal is wrong to start with. Most people want to go to heaven, but that's not our ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is to be resurrected bodies on the second. So you get the goal wrong, and then everything goes wrong after that. So he says, thus, if we want to speak of going to heaven when we die, we should be clear that this represents the first and far less important stage of a two-stage process. Resurrection isn't life after death, it's life after death. So that point, more simply, is if you want to say we go to heaven when we die, you're speaking of the first heaven. And that would be a transition to the second heaven. And he doesn't have any big problem with that. He just says that too many people make the first heaven their goal, not the resurrected body in the second. So he just ends up with that purgatory is just not a subject. I think it's just not even worth our time to speak a whole lot about. But if you care about purgatory, he's got several pages here, you can read it. So now I'm going to go to paradise. He talks, and I saw him on the bottom of page 171. He says, I therefore arrive at this view that all the Christians departed are in substantially the same state, that of restful happiness. Though that is sometimes described as sleep, we shouldn't take this to mean that it is a state of unconsciousness. Had Paul thought that, I very much doubt he would have described life immediately after death as being with Christ, which is far better. Rather, sleep here means that the body is asleep in the sense of dead, while the real person, however we want to describe him or her, continues. This state is not clearly the final destiny for which Christian dead are bound, which is, as we have seen, the bodily resurrection. Now, again, he uses lots of words to get to the same place we've talked about. Paul does use, in the New Testament writers, and Jesus used the idea of sleep. So there's no doubt that the concept of sleep is involved somewhere in this process. But exactly what sleep means in terms of eternity is a little more challenging. Remember, Jesus with Lazarus said, oh, and the little girl, they're not dead, they're asleep. Right? So there's something there that you can't dismiss the idea of sleep. He relates it to this idea of paradise, where it's this intermediate state where you are at rest until the final resurrection. And he says on the top of 172, there's no reason why this state should not be called heaven. Though we must note once more how interesting it is that the New Testament routinely doesn't call it that and uses the word heaven in different ways. So again, he's making the stance here, and it is part of his stance, is that this, when you die, you go to this intermediate state of rest before you finally go to to the final resurrection in the second heaven. He does talk about, and on page 173, he talks about the idea of praying to saints. Is that good or bad? And mostly he comes to the idea in the middle of 173. In the New Testament it is clear because of Christ in the Spirit, every single Christian is welcome at any time to come before the Father himself. And that's when he says to question this, even by implication, is to challenge one of the central blessings and privileges of the gospel. So we have no reason to pray to the saints. It's just no reason to do that. Now, is it evil? I'm not sure I want to take that stance. Is it unnecessary? Is it worthless? That's kind of how I view it. And we certainly don't need to. We have Christ as our intercessor, and that is very, very clear. And then I'm going to end this section with the bottom of 174. And I've said it over and over, but I'm going to say it one more time because he does. The important thing is that as we grasp the central hope is the key here, of the ultimate resurrection set within the new creation itself, and that we reorder all our thinking and speaking about every other after-death question in that light. And that, if you had to say one thing about this book, that's the thing that he wants you to take away. You should think of all afterlife stuff in light of you're going to be resurrected in a new body on a new earth. And that's everything about heaven should set up about that. So I'm going to stop there and see if anybody has any thoughts. I can tell you that was a brand new thought for me. I was always of the idea, oh, I die, go to heaven. And I was never taught about resurrected bodies and second heaven and living on earth with God. And I'm completely convinced that is the way I should be thinking of it. All right, we're going to go to page 178. We are eventually, starting next week, going to talk about order and chaos and the importance of order and chaos. So I'm going to point out this one verse, or this one sentence he has here on the bottom of 178. Judgment, the sovereign declaration that this is good and to be upheld and vindicated, and that is evil and to be condemned, is the only alternative to chaos. And then he says, we all know this perfectly well, yet we conveniently forget it whenever squeamishness or the demands of current opinion make it easier to go with the flow of social convention. We are obligated to believe that some things are good and some things are not good. They are evil. And that is going to go with the idea of God is righteous, just, and good God. Righteousness gets rewarded and evil gets punished. And we just have to have that view no matter what happens in society. Current society is, oh, there's really no evil, so there can't be any punishment. Everything's fine. And if you believe differently, you're just intolerant. So, Adenta?
I was just going to say that people that think that God, because God is so loving, he can never punish anyone, but we know that isn't true from the Old Testament.
Right.
And he can be loving. I mean, he is loving as long as we're loving back. But if we don't love him back, then we're like the Old Testament, and the evil people do get punished. That's what I'm.
And it's in the New Testament too. Jesus talks about it over and over. Jesus is very clearly on the side of evil gets punished. You just can't get by that with Jesus. And that's what people want to get by. People want to vision Jesus as all about lovey-dovey. Everything's fine. All Christians should love each other and love everybody in the world and accept them no matter what they want to do. So we have to either decide we are going to live by the standards of God or not have any standards at all, because that's what the world's finally come to. There's no
Is
standard.
just.
Say that again, Carolyn.
He is just.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we're reminded of that over and over. So,
And that's going to be the difference in Christians and everybody else. It is already that we will accept the standards of God as set in the Bible, or we're not. And that's just all it's going to boil down to. And he's going to make that case here that God is, due to God's nature, that's okay. So let's go ahead to page 179. And this is always his point. God is utterly committed to set the world right in the end. This doctrine, like the resurrection itself, is held firmly in place by the belief in God as creator on one side and the belief in his goodness on the other. And that setting right must necessarily involve the elimination of all that distorts God's good, lovely creation, and in particular, all that defaces his image-bearing human creatures. In other words, it all depends on believing that God will eliminate evil. As we talked about last week with Phinehas, God hates evil. He just does, because it distorts everything. Then he talks about there are, on the bottom of page 179, they're flashing red lights to warn against going down a road that leads to a fenceless cliff. That struck me because my friend that died this last week went over a cliff. My friend of a friend who died this week went over a cliff in California and died. So it was a fenceless cliff, and this immediately struck me last night when I reread this. He's talking about behavior that leads to death. Three things in common about them. They stem from a primal fault, which is an idolatry, that worshiping that which is not God as if it were. That's what idolatry is. We worship something as if it were God, but it's not. The second is they show the telltale marks of the consequent fault, which is subhuman behavior. Now, I love that term because I think about subhuman behavior differently than he does. Subhuman behavior in his world is the failure to reflect the image of God, that missing the mark as regards full, free, and genuine humanness, which is the New Testament word for sin. So it's not the breaking of the rules. The rules are just sketches of different types of dehumanizing behavior. And then we'll talk about that in a minute. And then he says, third, idolatry and dehumanization becomes so endemic in life and the chosen behavior of an individual, and indeed of groups, that unless there's a specific turning away from such a way of life, those who persist are conniving at their own ultimate dehumanization. In other words, God doesn't have to make you dehumanize yourself. You will do it yourself. If you insist on that kind of behavior, you will become that kind of a person. Just like your mama used to say. You keep doing that, that's who you become. Mama was right. Then he will launch into the idea of what it means to be saved, what it means to be condemned. And we talked about that earlier. Does that mean you're in constant torment? And he will go through on pages 180, 181, 182, talking about the different ideas about hell. But I want to point out a couple of things that I think are very interesting. I love natural laws. I love laws that are not behavior laws, but they just say, if you behave this way, then certain things will happen. Nobody has to punish you. It just happens. And particular behaviors, if you're going to drink every night, eventually you're going to become an alcoholic and your body's going to get punished and so on. Nobody has to do that to you. You've done it to yourself. It's a natural law. So he says in the middle top of 182, one of the primary laws of human life is that you become like what you worship. And what's more, you reflect what you worship, not only back to the object itself, but also outward to the world around. Those who worship money increasingly define themselves in terms of it and start treating people in terms of money. So what you worship determines what you become. And I think that's one of the natural rules. And that's where he goes off kind of his idea of hell could be the idea that if you want to act as a subhuman in his definition, that you will eventually become subhuman and quit bearing the image of God. And which I think is pretty interesting. He does admit in the middle of page 193 that these are all deep, dark mysteries. He doesn't have the answers. He's giving you his best shot. But what he says is important is he's happy to be proved wrong, but not at the cost of the foundational claims that this world is a good creation of the one true God, and that he will at the end bring about that judgment at which the whole creation will rejoice. And I believe that's true. I think everything about the Bible teaches, not only will we rejoice at that judgment, but the whole creation is going to. I think we talked about that just yesterday. Trees are going to clap their hands. Oceans are going to roar with joy. All creation is going to be happy when God brings his judgment into view. And he doesn't sugarcoat it at the bottom of 183. Paul in Romans is quite clear that there will indeed be final condemnation for those who are factious and disobey the truth, but obey wickedness. Paul doesn't sugarcoat it. The wicked will be punished. want to skip to kind of the bottom of 185 because we're going to be talking about this in the coming couple of weeks. And this is the lower middle of page 185. The purpose of the current, let's see, I'll have to go back up to this long sentence. Israel believed that the purpose of the Creator God all came down to this question. How is God going to rescue Israel? What the gospel of Jesus revealed, however, was that the purposes of God were reaching out to a different question. How is God going to rescue the world through Israel and thereby rescue Israel itself as part of the process, but not as the point of it all? And we're getting ready to get into that. The Israelites thought God was all about saving them, but that wasn't what God's point was. And that's why Jesus sometimes got harassed a lot, because he's going, it's not about Israel. It's about how through Israel, the whole world will be saved. So he goes ahead and takes that question and moves it down there. He says, maybe what we are faced with in our own day is a similar challenge, to focus not on the question of which human beings God is to take to heaven and how he's going to do it, but on the question of how God is going to redeem and renew his creation through human beings and how he's going to rescue those humans themselves as part of the process, but not as the point of it all. My words are, I think what he's saying is, so many Christians are focused on how is God going to take me to heaven? How am I going to get saved? That's what we focus on. His point is God is trying to redeem and renew all creation through human beings. And as part of that process, the righteous human beings will be saved. We're part of the process, not the point of the process. And we're part of that process actually as part of the church. That's an important part that we'll find out too. I'm especially sensitive on this because I'm parts of some other Bible studies and have been parts where so many questions always come down to people will ask the question, well, you mean I'm not saved? You mean I don't get to go to heaven? It's all focused about that. And his point is that's not the focus. We're the process. We're part of the process. And as an end result, we get to be rewarded as the righteous. And I probably stepped on toes, and I may get kicked out of the church if the elders watch all of this. But I'll make them read the book before they kick me out, and then nobody will be able to get through the whole book. Although I know Don Milliken and Mitch have, so I'll have them on my side. All right. Anybody have anything they want to add?
Well, this is what spoke to me was on 184, that this is not the end game.
Yep. It's not. Yep. And we've so long made it. It's like, why do you go to church 3 times a week? Because I want to go to heaven. Or I don't want to go to hell, more likely. But that's not why we should be going to church 3 times a week. But it's going to get more fun starting next week. I promised you that we would finally get to parts that you will easily understand and enjoy, and I think we're finally there.
Yes, we are there.
So I am glad for that. We have I wouldn't say we've suffered, but we've disciplined ourselves to learn new words and to get us to this point. And now what I really find I'm so happy about is that now we're going to talk about what the early church was so excited about. Why the early church behaved the way they did, why Christianity spread the way it spread. And we're finally going to get there. So I'm excited about that.
Is that
And we're
chapter
gonna-
12?
Chapter 12 will be, yeah. And I really hope everybody's going to enjoy this for the next few weeks. Because one of the good things about it for people on this call, I know most of you fairly well, you're going to finally find out you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. You don't need to feel guilty. You just need to enjoy what you're doing and do more of it. Just I get to have a conversation with one of our elders next week on spiritual gifts. And the final question is, so what? Why do we get spiritual gifts? What's the so what of that? And that will come into play with what we're talking about. All right, we're going to stop there, but first we're going to meet LaDenta's maybe grandchild. LaDenta, there you go.
Yeah.
Talk to her.
Okay, just a minute. Let me get her in here. This is Maddie.
Hi, Maddie.
This is my little historian that I went to see last night. Tell them who
Oh,
you were.
I was Kate Warren, the First Lady Pinkerton detective.
First lady detective.
wow. That's cool. When was she alive, or when was she a detective?
It was pre-women's rights, so it's pretty amazing that
She helped Abraham Lincoln. if that
she
gives you
did.
some
Okay,
context.
here's my son Mitch
Hi.
Hi, Mitch.
and my
Mitch.
daughter-in-law Chris.
Hi.
Hello. So Kate
glad-
Warren was in the pre the 19th Amendment. She was friends with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. So she managed to get a man's job before women were allowed to work. Pretty
Wow.
impressive. Pretty impressive lady.
She did a great job last night. It was fun.
You're a pretty impressive lady too.
Okay, I just want you to meet my
Well,
family.
we're
Thank
happy to
you.
meet y'all. Thank you for sharing
It was nice
your
to meet you.
Yeah,
sharing LaDenta with us today. All right, you guys have
Oh,
a
you
great
bet.
lunch. All right.
Thank you.
thank
Love
you.
everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, guys.